So welcome to Talks at Google. To this afternoon, we're very thrilled to host Greg Ferenstein, who is a former political journalist for TechCrunch, where among his other skills, he taught mathematics to journalists, which is always an important thing to do. He's here speaking to us today about his latest thesis, which arose out of some Medium posts and some articles for TechCrunch, Silicon Valley's political endgame. So this strange mixture of libertarianism and progressivism we have here, what does that mean? Where is it going? How does it impact the local and national issues we face? So with that, please join me in welcoming Greg to Google. Thanks.
Thanks for having me. I kind of want to thank you guys, because I think about 70% of all of my internet experience is at Google itself. Google Docs, Google Maps, everything. It's my internet experience and digital life is basically Google. So thank you. Appreciate it, guys. In 1981, the Ottawa Citizen newspaper reported on a story from a University of Carleton professor who claimed that if teachers don't stand up to the growing invasion of computers in the classroom, there's a good chance that literacy will disappear in 10 years. Obviously, these were not prophetic words. When I first began researching the politics and philosophy of breakthrough innovators, I started with what I knew it wasn't. And I knew it wasn't pessimism. You wouldn't dedicate your life to trying to improve the future if you thought the outlook was bleak. And indeed, when I then began systematically to interview breakthrough innovators about their philosophy, what was core to them, first and foremost, above all else, they described themselves as optimists. We're working with two different devices here. Wikipedia founder, Jimmy Wales. I'm a pathologically optimistic person. Mark Zuckerberg. I'm an optimist. I think you need to be an entrepreneur. I may be the most optimistic person I know. I mean, I'm incredibly optimistic. I'm optimistic arguably to a fault, especially in terms of new ideas. Mark Andreessen. Steve Jobs. I'm an optimist in the sense that I believe humans are noble and honorable. And some of them are really smart. I have a very optimistic view of individuals. At first, I dismissed this optimism as just kind of like hippie frou-frou of Silicon Valley. But then I learned this optimism was just a rhetorical wrapper around very specific business strategies and political policies. The motivation originally behind this was that technologists all of a sudden are becoming very influential. At least according to Forbes, over 80% of billionaires on the Forbes 400 list, under 40, come from technology. So whatever these folks believe is going to exert an extraordinary amount of influence over the future. So I wanted to answer three questions. One, does the optimism of information technologists have a unique worldview? Is it just that they're good at technology and they happen to do politics, or are they somehow combined? Does this worldview help them make technology? That is there something about their politics and their vision for the future that is behind and almost a prerequisite for billion-dollar ideas? And the last is this worldview shared by just a small number of very rich and very successful people, or is it part of a broader political movement? The answer to all of these, I think, is yes. And because I'm attention deficit and I assume my audience is too, I will just go ahead and tell you my thesis before I go in with the explanation. The world has gotten more complex. As a result, it's given rise to the knowledge economy. The knowledge economy has empowered a novelty-seeking personality that has an extreme optimism in information alone to solve problems. This is built on a growing demographic of college-educated, urbanized professionals who represent an entirely new political category. They are pro-government and pro-market, but believe the government's role isn't to regulate capitalism, but to invest in capitalism, to accelerate change by investing directly in citizens to be more educated, entrepreneurial, and civic. If you take away nothing else, very simple, betting that information will make the future has become a very profitable belief system. And that, essentially, is why optimists will inherit the earth. The rest is explanation. All right, so starting with the first question. What do these folks believe? The best explanation actually came from the patron of this organization, Eric Schmidt. He said, there's a particular religion that we all represent, and it goes something like this. If you take a large number of people and you empower them with communication tools and opportunities to be created, society gets better. The combination of empowerment, innovation, and creativity will be our solution, and that is a religion in of itself. So the folks who make breakthrough technologies and help them along are cognizant that they have a distinct worldview. So when I delve deeper into Eric's and other people's idea that somehow citizens, just through empowerment, could make the world a better place, I found that their philosophy was founded on two main ideas. First, as Reid Hoffman told me, if you're working towards progress, your future will be better than your present. That is, change is inherently good. The very nature of change makes things better. Now, change can often be bad over the short term. You can have a bad 20 or 30 years even. But eventually, if you just keep trying, if you just keep changing and disrupting, eventually things get better. This is the first tenet of optimism, or at least described by Silicon Valley. So then I took what I was learning from Reid Hoffman and other folks, and I said, is this just the very wealthy in Silicon Valley, or is it technologists more broadly? So I'm a former writer for a tech blog called TechCrunch. They have a database of every single startup founder ever. I found their email addresses and randomly emailed them to take a battery of 40 political psychology questions, which became what I think is the first representative political opinion poll of what Silicon Valley believes. And I peppered them with some of these statements. Indeed, when you ask, is change inherently good or productive over the long term, 80% of tech founders say yes, near unanimity. That number is unheard of in political opinion polling. You rarely get numbers that big. When I compared that same question to a survey done of the general population, only 48% of people agreed that change inherently over the long run is good. Now, this gets into why the Valley is generally kind of considered libertarian, this kind of free market ideology, anything goes, let's change as quickly as possible. When you compare tech founders with libertarians and Democrats, they look like libertarians on a couple big issues. They're not as big of fans of labor unions. They tend to believe that labor unions, especially teachers' unions, tend to protect the status quo and prevent organizations from experimenting and piloting new things and moving into the future very quickly. So about 29% of tech founders think that labor unions are good for the economy, and 21% of libertarians. On the flip side, they're radically pro-free trade. NAFTA, TPP, they want capitalism everywhere. And that's where this myth that the Silicon Valley is generally libertarian comes from. That would be true, except for the fact that Silicon Valley as a whole is arguably the most liberal industry on planet Earth. 83% of donations in the 2012 presidential election from top tech firms like Google, Facebook, and Amazon went to Obama versus Romney. 83%. If you look at all donations back to 2008, from every single tech founder and investor, 63% went to Democrats. In my survey of tech founders, about 7% identify as Republican. So clearly, if we want to understand what tech founders in Silicon Valley believes, thinking that they're libertarian was missing something. Why are they such a big fan of the Democratic Party? And this I learned when a libertarian icon in the Senate, Rand Paul, announced his presidential candidacy and came to San Francisco. And he got up on stage, he was really excited, he wanted to warm up the crowd, and he led with this.
Is there anybody out here from the Leave Me Alone Coalition?
Right? He said, is anyone out here from the Leave Me Alone coalition? No one clapped, and it was really awkward. Leave me alone, get government out of my life is central to the libertarian philosophy, and yet it was not popular in San Francisco. This led me to do some more questioning. So one of the central tenets of libertarianism is that there is a conflict between government and citizens. On the flip side, Democrats tend to believe that there's a conflict between citizens and big corporations. The richer corporations get, the less citizens have. Tech founders, as a group, overwhelmingly believe that there's no conflict between business, corporations, or citizens. At 61%, they say everyone has a role in society and they can all work together, compared to just 20% of the public. They have an optimism that collectivism and interdependence is possible. When I dug deeper into that theory, I learned that a popular term in the Valley is what's called non-zero-sum economy, a non-zero-sum economy. The idea that you can build things that benefit people. Even if some people benefit a little bit more, you raise the tide for everyone. The core of this popular non-zero-sum meme in Silicon Valley is that what is good for you is good for me. What is bad for you is also bad for me. So I asked this question. Does everything people do, including their personal decisions, like whether to be educated or eat healthy, affect enough other people to justify government intervention? A near majority, 49% of founders believe that. Only 20% of libertarians and 60% of Democrats. That is, they think interdependence is part of society, that we are connected. And so now we have a working definition of optimism. There is always a better solution that benefits more people. I think most reasonable people at this point would be asking themselves, what is the connection between technology and politics? You've shown me a lot of correlations, but what do the two have to do with each other? I kind of want to make the case to you that technology is, not, if not mostly political, inherently political. If you build a missile, you build it for a reason. You're trying to protect the country. Hawkish people who are fearful of other countries or terrorists build military technologies. If any of you guys know any Bitcoin folks, the anonymous cryptocurrency that is an alternative to money, the community started out hyper-libertarian. They wanted to free the economy from the confines of the government and its control over the cash supply. So what I did is I found a way to predict someone's political ideology from the products they built. I looked at every single public political donation, Federal Elections Commission, and I matched that to tech founders. And I found that indeed, you might have trouble reading this slide, but this is the political orientation grouped by startup category. If you work in finance, in cybersecurity, you're more likely to be a hawkish Republican or a libertarian, which is kind of what we thought. The most liberal category in all of startup land, or one of them, social networking. Why is that the case? Why is a social network political at all? And that's what I find fascinating, because the actual politics of Silicon Valley and technologists and tech workers are so distinct from our traditional categories, we don't even recognize that a social network has in fact a policy analog. And what I want to show you that is the differences between MySpace and Facebook. If you can remember all the way back in internet history, back to 2006, MySpace was king of kings. And they had an idea that social networking was about expression. On the left here, you see, or it's your right, you see a MySpace page. And you can do whatever you want. You could make it annoying. You could have autoplay music. MySpace didn't care. They encouraged this. When pornographic stars were kicked off of earlier social networks, they invited them on MySpace. Do whatever you want. It is a libertarian expression paradise. And the culture of their users ate it up. There was a phrase that went viral before we kind of knew what viral meant. In 2006 on MySpace, it said, "Don't judge me." This is what people plastered all over their profiles. It was so popular that it spawned its own kind of gaudy t-shirt line in like rhinestone that said the "Don't Judge Me" t-shirt line. Zuckerberg and co. had a different philosophy. Zuckerberg said, on MySpace, people got to do whatever they wanted in a profile. We always thought people would share more if we didn't let them do whatever they wanted because we gave them some order. Facebook had a North Star, Sheryl Sandberg. Mark really does believe very much in transparency and the vision of an open society and an open world. And so he wants to push people that way. So one of the early things that Facebook did was they did auto-tagging of photos. And they eventually turned that into the news feed. And if you remember, there was a massive backlash. Zuckerberg personally had to make a statement on the front page of Facebook or in people's feeds. He's like, I get it. You're worried about privacy. You're worried about what's going on. But we have this vision for the world, and we're going to continue doing the newsfeed. And we're going to continue trying to push people to share more information. Because he believed, and this is often made fun of, that just getting people to share cat videos or what they're doing at a wedding or what they believe or an article, just sharing information was a way to make the world a better place. Doesn't seem very political. We know it is because one of Facebook's first users was this guy, Harvard University professor Robert Putnam. Putnam became famous for this idea of social capital. It's a theory that says the best way to improve the governance of a city, to make people healthier, to make economies more equal, to make the bureaucracy more efficient, is simply to get people to hang out more on an informal basis. Bowling leagues, book clubs, Rotary clubs. He found this in a 25-year-long study of Italy. And he wanted to know why some sections in the north, like Emilia, were much more prosperous and equal and healthy. And after 25 years of studying every variable in political science, he found one simple pattern. In the north, there was more community. Specifically, people just hung out more. That simple fact of northern Italy made them a much better society. And now, governments around the world, sometimes with the UN, it is a policy, a public policy to get people to hang out more on an informal basis. Social capital, as a political theory, has been replicated dozens of times, sometimes experimentally. And find out if you share informal things, things get better. Facebook was the technological manifestation of that policy. And a rather optimistic policy at that. You want the world to get better? Just have people talk more. Ultimately, it's an informational philosophy. People share information about government services or what people are doing wrong or right in their neighborhood, and they also exchange empathy. They get to know each other. So if Silicon Valley represents an entirely new political category, people often ask me, what does this look like in an actual policy, modern day? Google's backyard, San Francisco. One of the distinct beliefs that I learned about Silicon Valley was they believed that cities, bringing people to cities was a moral good. Often, the San Francisco housing crisis is often kind of couched in terms of tech people just wanting cheaper rent and Google not having to have to pay higher salaries because that's the only way that their workers can afford to live close to campus. And if you're not familiar with the San Francisco housing crisis, although I assume most folks in here are, or the Bay Area housing crisis, for those watching online, only 8% of housing is now affordable in San Francisco because the city has tried to protect its suburbs and won't allow buildings to get taller or more dense. They've just literally restricted any type of a lot of dense buildings. Median rents, even if you can't buy a home, median rents have skyrocketed above $4,000 a month. Thousands of people have been evicted from their homes from landlords who see that they can now sell, a relatively inexpensive home for over $1 million or $2. So as a result, you have this massive conflict between kind of technologists and some renters who want to build more, and critics who say that Google and tech companies and the rest of the creative class that are coming in just want to take over the city. For 6,000 years of technological history, cities have been the birthplace for information technology. Writing likely happened around the time of Mesopotamia, when people gathered for the first time in such large groups that they began to have grain surpluses and they couldn't account for what everyone had. So they had cuneiform tablets and they made little tick marks. And that's how they were able to keep track of who had what food and items. Complexity, especially in cities, is the birthplace of many information technologies, and it's been that way for 6,000 years. So to believe in cities isn't just to believe you want cheaper rent, is to believe that one of the best things you can do for humanity is to bring them to cities. This is what San Francisco looks like as an affordable city. That's a simulation I did based on econometric estimates of San Francisco with almost double the housing stock it has now, 200,000 more units. Now we know that, I made the case that information technologists, Silicon Valley, and urbanized professionals have a distinct political category, and we know what it kind of looks like in policy. The title of the talk is Why Optimists Will Inherit the Earth. It turns out that the dividing line, at least within the Democratic Party, over people who are more optimistic about change, a little bit more collectivist in orientation, a bigger fan of free trade, and an investment orientation of government, happens to be college education. The more college educated you are, the more you tend to believe in this philosophy. Over the last decades, if you can see this slide, the share of people voting in Democratic elections, or presidential elections that are Democrats, are college educated, have grown a lot, and are now the majority of voters. This radically altered the leadership of at least one party. The picture you see above is congressional leadership. So the blue areas represent leaders in Congress who were at one time very popular, measured by when they introduce a bill, a lot of their colleagues sign on. It used to be Union County, the middle of the country. But as urbanized professionals and college-educated people went to the cities, it split. 30 years later, the leadership is now on the coasts. Think Nancy Pelosi in San Francisco, Hillary Clinton in New York. This is to say, this is how systematically the people who are most optimistic built technologies, they made some money, they wanted to move to cities, they became a majority of voters and large donors, and at least in one party, it is now shifted more towards that orientation, towards a more investment orientation of government. I'll leave why I think it's going to be the most influential. This is a map of every major information technology ever invented, all the way back to the Macedonians. When I began studying the history and the philosophy of those who invented big technologies, they sounded like Silicon Valley folks. Socrates, who with Plato and Aristotle, invented the academy, kind of some of the first official schooling, said there is only one good, knowledge, and one evil, ignorance. Socrates was killed for that belief. Centuries later, Charles Babbage, who created one of the first programmable computers, said knowledge is power. Babbage wasn't killed, but he wasn't a very wealthy man, and the government at the time decided not to invest in his project. They didn't see any future for a computer. Sean Parker, founding president of Facebook, told me, it's the hacker ethic that a lot of problems in the world are information inefficiencies. And he's a billionaire. The growing complexity of the world will, for the first time in human history, allow this very ancient ideology to become either the most powerful or a very powerful influence over the world. And that is why optimists will inherit the earth.
Through your research and through your interviews, is it a matter of the sort of big voices carrying the most weight? I'm thinking of the folks that want to split California into six different states, the libertarian paradise to be established in international waters. How does that impact the sort of studies you found with the overall progressive mentality of the Silicon Valley?
So I don't know where the myth that Silicon Valley was libertarian came from. I suspect it fit into a kind of a narrative. Speaking as a writer, it was easy to say, okay, these folks don't like government regulation, and they're big fans of capitalism, and they also like money, therefore they must be libertarian. And so these kind of like weird projects like trying to split California into 6 states or create a floating city off the coast of California that doesn't have any US government regulation, it fit into that narrative, and so it was given an outside voice in the press. What you didn't see was, in fact, that almost all donations from top tech companies go to Democrats in presidential elections. So I think what happened was it was just the media picking up on a narrative that wasn't true.
To what extent do you think people are fooling themselves about knowledge and what they really consider knowledge? Like, there's a lot of knowledge in, say, the third world that probably isn't thought about very much in Silicon Valley. There's knowledge that is not optimistic. Say, unions are seen as like complaining, so that knowledge seems to get discounted. I think knowledge here is seen as optimism and seen as knowledge that's around Silicon Valley. Do you think that's true? Do you think that the knowledge is really, it's really narrower than really all knowledge, I guess?
Well, I think just philosophically, the idea that most folks, when they start a company, or at least information technology companies, they have this kind of general theory that whatever knowledge they're putting out into the world somehow makes it better. In the case of Facebook, they believe that people sharing information and pictures of their family would create more connections between people. People would develop empathy. Bipartisanship would be, or we would be more bipartisan nation, things like this. When it came to Twitter, the founders of Twitter told me that it started out as kind of like an information broadcasting service where one of the founders was on a BART, and if he experienced an earthquake, he would want to let everyone know that he was okay, right? So when I say information, it's tackled like one product at a time. And it's one bill at a time. So the idea of cities, inviting people, like building very dense and tall cities, the idea is that you can invite people of all income brackets into the same area. They can enjoy the same schools and job opportunities. And you can invite smart people from all over the country to work in the most productive companies. So to say, I'm using knowledge kind of writ large, but it's tackled one policy, one product at a time. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I'm not sure. But just to pick up on the city, so the idea is people can all come together in a city, but the actual reality is the rentals have gone up, and so people are getting have to leave the city, and it's becoming more of a monoculture in that sense, in some way.
And that's because San Francisco systematically refuses to build more housing. Right? More people could live here if it was denser and taller and you could build faster, there wasn't as much regulation around. That would solve, I think, that monoculture problem. Seattle, the New York area, much more diverse because a more diverse set of people can afford to live there. And that's why solving the San Francisco housing crisis is very core to the technology political philosophy. And I will say, I will just say this, thank you for bringing that up, that if you're interested in solving the crisis, you can go to affordablesanfrancisco.com, and I am going to be helping out with others who are doing campaigns to actually introduce legislation that allows San Francisco to become denser and taller and build more quickly.
So you mentioned the non-zero-sum game outlook of technologists. And for things like material benefits, healthcare, that is absolutely true. But for political power, there is a fixed amount of political decision-making which happens in the world. And disparity in political agency is growing as well. This has been complained about by both the Bernie Sanders supporters and the Donald Trump supporters. This growing populist movement that is saying they have no voice in the governance of the world. How do you see the growing power from the politics of the technologists interacting with this populist movement?
What I see from the civic sector of startups is trying to empower more voices. So if you look at change.org, Sean Parker's and Matt Meehan's brigade, what they're trying to do is build technologies that allow people without much money to influence politics. So change.org. You don't need to give any money. All you need to do is sign a petition. And if enough people do that, it gets media attention. Some people believe that that helped at least influence the Boy Scouts' decision to accept LGBT scout leaders. So I think it is the hope of many people in Silicon Valley that their technology will distribute political influence more evenly.
What happens when you talk to people who are not in Silicon Valley about this, who don't have a favorable view? How do they react to this philosophy, and what do they think of it?
So I think this, when I say Silicon Valley, I mean kind of a cultural movement. So broadly urbanized, educated professionals. That's a lot of people. Not everyone agrees with it, and everyone has their own issues. So traditional Democrats, especially out of like the Bernie Sanders camp, fear inequality of any type. They think if you're rich and if you're part of a tech company, inherently what you're going to do is just try to empower yourself and screw everyone else. And so what they want to do is they want to limit technology companies. They want to slow growth, whether it's Uber and Lyft, through regulations, and redistribute like power and money. That's generally the reaction I get. They do not believe, or at least they have a resistance to believe, that you can be a big corporation or a widely used product and be generally good for most people. Power inherently corrupts. That's kind of the orientation they have. And against that, there's not a lot you can say, because to be a popular tech product, you need to be used by a lot of people. To have it be sustainable, it needs to make a lot of money. You can win them over on some issues, like housing in San Francisco or education. If you make education cheaper, like Udacity and Coursera, top universities in the world, which were once reserved for very wealthy people who could afford Stanford and Harvard, now everyone can take their classes for free. So I think on some issues, you'll win that crowd over. Philosophically, probably not, but on the issues, yes. I don't know if that answers your question.
What about rural conservatives? Same question.
Rural conservatives. I haven't. Maybe just because I don't have a lot of touch points with rural conservatives, but I haven't seen a lot of complaints from that camp. So I don't know. I have no idea. If I hear if someone pings me on Twitter and says, I'm a rural conservative and I don't like you, then I'll be able to engage with that person. Or if anyone listening online is a rural conservative, email me, tweet at me. We'll have a conversation.
you mentioned you based a lot of this on this survey that you did. Was there controls to, because that's somewhat of self-selection as to who returns the survey. Perhaps it was just all the libertarians. Perhaps it was all Democrats. How did you do controls for that?
Well, so you can't do controls in a survey. Surveys are all political opinion surveys, unless you strap someone down and torture them until they answer questions, are by definition voluntary. What you hope is that you get a broad enough sample of people, and that the people who answer your question, so I guess what you hope is that the reason why someone answers your question is independent of their political ideology. So if you believe that if you're more libertarian or culturally conservative, you're more likely to answer any opinion poll, then yes, it's a problem. Just speaking kind of broadly about public opinion polling, political opinion polling, I think some surveys show that conservatives are popular in some states and liberals are popular in other states. So just answering a survey seems to be independent of your political ideology. I tried to sample enough founders. I sampled about 144. The margin of error was about plus or minus 7%.
I guess historically the Democratic Party has, I think of as having in mind the concerns of working class people. And it seems like this new movement within the party seems very meritocratic and is okay with inequality. And how do you see the future playing out in terms of the Bernie Sanders camp of the Democratic Party, I guess, and the people who seem to be looking out for the interests of working class people, and the more meritocratic side that seems to just want to empower people but may not look out for people who are super motivated and driven to capitalize on those opportunities?
So that's a really good question. I'm glad you asked it. I'm going to give a little bit of a lengthy answer, but I'll try to keep it short. So I once thought that this ideology was pretty tied to income. If you made a lot of money and you were highly educated, you tended to believe this thing. I was wrong. I started doing surveys, thanks to the Google Surveys team, actually. They're great. Of gig economy workers in San Francisco. I was able to filter people who worked for Uber and Lyft and Instacart and TaskRabbit. Gig economy workers have a political profile much closer to tech workers than people who tell me they're in a union. This makes sense. They have a more entrepreneurial lifestyle. They are bigger fans of high-skilled immigrants like tech workers, because high-skilled immigrants help create the products that give them a job. On presidential candidates, they're bigger fans of Hillary Clinton than Bernie Sanders, who potentially could be the person to regulate technology, if he ever got to be president, more so than Clinton. Because they live an entrepreneurial existence, they're more like tech workers and they need a similar role for government. It turns out that this has happened before in Democratic history. The original progressives, people who called themselves progressives in the Democratic Party, go all the way back to 1840. Originally, the Democratic Party as a whole was against free trade. This was before the United States had much of a free trade agreement at all. And when the government tried to introduce more free trade principles, the bill failed. When the new high-tech industry of the time in the 1840s, the railroads, partnered with low-skilled farm workers who wanted to sell their goods abroad, they banded together a high-skilled industry and a low-skilled industry to fundamentally change America's economic stance to the rest of the world. This is happening, I believe, 150 years later with tech workers and gig economy workers. The same alliance, just different policies. That was a long answer. Thank you.
I'm wondering about this urban versus rural theme you have, though, because I have the feeling it's a little bit too biased towards high density, big cities and so on. When you actually look at the places where most of the major innovations are coming from, I think it's actually suburbia. University campuses, suburbia, and so on, and they're not very dense. So, obviously, we are at Google. It's not that urban. If you look at the other companies, Facebook, all the big heavy hitters, like even recent ones, WhatsApp was Mountain View downtown, I think. And if you go further back, like if you look at the history of Silicon Valley, IBM invented basically this corporate campus somewhere in the South Bay. Like if you look through the history, my point is that cities are not a prerequisite for, I mean, high density cities are not a prerequisite and probably not the best place to do to really move the needle with innovation. And San Francisco has certainly some startups, and I think the scene has shifted more towards San Francisco in recent years, but I'm not sure of the cause and effect there, so maybe you can talk about this a bit.
No, that's an excellent question. The idea is that, especially Silicon Valley, when it started, in the 60s and then kind of grow in the 70s and 80s, tended to be a little bit more suburban. So why are cities necessary? So there's two responses to that. One is, relatively speaking, the Bay Area is still extremely dense compared to the middle of the country. Where I'm from, Omaha, Nebraska, and the rest of these, even though it doesn't look as dense because there's kind of single family home houses, there's a lot of them. And no one really has big yards here. Right? So compared to the rest of the country, and in New York as well, still relatively dense. The other argument is that even if all of the invention is kind of happening in the outer suburbs of major metropolitan regions, a lot of the technologies are built for folks living in cities to solve city problems. Google Maps, right? The idea that you need to look at a map because you don't know where you're going is a city phenomenon. When I lived in Omaha, I didn't need a map. I knew where I was going. I went to basically the same places every day. Airbnb, the idea that you would need to sleep on someone's couch, one, there would be enough couches. B, there would be that many people to support an entire industry, only happened because of cities. So a lot of the new technology, especially in the sharing economy, Craigslist, all happened because there was so much complexity and so much stuff in the system that someone needed to simplify it and help people share resources. In small towns, you can do that analog style. You just know everyone. So that's generally why cities are important. On the data side, economics, there's a Berkeley professor named Enrico Moretti. He calculated that housing restrictions in 3 cities, San Jose, San Francisco, and New York, kneecaps national GDP by 10%. Because there's a lot of talented coders in the world. If a coder in Oklahoma can move to Mountain View and work at Google, they're a lot more productive than any company they're going to work for in the Midwest.
So with something you said earlier, it kind of alluded to something, you don't really know that many rural conservatives. This is a growing trend. Not the not knowing of rural conservatives, but the ideological purity of social groups. Social networks are growing larger, but they are becoming described as echo chambers. Do you see this as a trend which is related to the technologists continuing, declining? What do you see the future path of the composition of social groups and how it relates to what you talked about?
I would love to be optimistic on this one. I am not. I do believe that ultimately people who are optimistic are going to shape the future, hence the presentation. But the internet is a very large echo chamber. If you look at let's just take Donald Trump supporters, there are websites that cater to them. Breitbart.com, to some extent theblaze.com, Fox News. Even though they are incredibly popular, tens of millions of readers, some of the largest and most powerful news organizations on the internet, they are rarely quoted by mainstream media, Washington Post, New York Times, and even some of the more liberal outlets. An entire movement was built to elect a president, and it was considered a joke by most of the mainstream media. Not because they necessarily disagreed, but because they had so little touch with the other half of the country that they didn't even realize it existed. If we are to solve this problem, we will likely have to bridge those groups. I don't know how to do that. That said, still an optimist.
Well, on that note, thank you very much for speaking with us today, and
Thanks for having me.
we look forward to hearing more about your research in the future.
Great. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Internet.